Mark Carney has now turned down what may be the harshest trade demand an American president has ever placed before an allied country. This was not a revised proposal. It was not a plea for additional time. It was not the familiar diplomatic maneuver where a government rejects something in public while quietly working toward acceptance behind closed doors. This was a rejection, open, final, and delivered with one word that trade attorneys, for historians of diplomacy, and economists immediately understood to mean there was no way back. Donald Trump set a deadline for Canada. He attached conditions meant to leave Ottawa with almost no room to refuse. 4. Those conditions were supported by the economic force of the largest consumer market on the planet. They carried a threat so serious that 3 allied governments privately urged Canada to give in before the clock ran out. 4. Warning that the consequences of refusal would be too severe. Carney examined the conditions. He studied the deadline. He understood the threat, and then he said no. What unfolded during the next 72 hours is the reason this moment matters. Not because Canada simply prevailed in a trade fight. Trade disputes are won and lost all the time. 4. What collapsed in those 72 hours was something far larger than a negotiation. It was a belief that has shaped American economic diplomacy for most of the last century. 4. The belief that resisting the United States always costs more than obeying it. The belief that no country, especially one roughly 1/10 America's size, would dare absorb the consequences of rejecting a direct American economic ultimatum. Carney did more than reject the demand. He showed that the belief was wrong. And 3 of the most respected economists in the world used the same word to describe what that means for the global economic system. Permanent, less than 48 hours after Canada's refusal. 4. The European Union released an official statement defending the right of nations to make independent trade decisions. Japan moved forward on 2 bilateral agreements that had been stuck for months. 4. The United Kingdom began reshaping its North American trade approach, and 4 countries that had been quietly negotiating compliance with their own American trade pressures suddenly put those talks on hold. 4. Warren Buffett described it as the most important single act of economic defiance since George Soros broke the Bank of England in 1992. According to Buffett, Carney had done what many in business and politics fail to understand. 4. The most dangerous moment for a dominant power is not when it is challenged. It is when it is challenged and the challenge works, because a successful challenge does not only alter the position of the challenger. It alters what everyone else believes is possible, and once assumptions change, they do not simply return to what they were. But the crucial point is what Carney actually said, the exact wording. 4. The one word that turned the decision into something irreversible. When you understand his phrasing, the way he delivered it, why it was crafted with the care of a legal document rather than the rhythm of a political speech. 4. And what Buffett later explained about how that word damaged the machinery of American trade leverage. You begin to see why this is not merely another chapter in a confrontation between Washington and Ottawa. It may be the point where that confrontation became a small part of something much bigger, because the effects of this refusal are now spreading through every American trade relationship in the world. 12 countries have already started adjusting their positions, and the White House still has not issued a full response. Not because silence is the strategy, but because every response placed on the table makes the problem worse. To understand the rejection, you first have to understand exactly what Trump demanded. The meaning of the refusal depends entirely on the terms being refused, and what Canada rejected was not a normal trade proposal. It was a demand for economic subordination, wrapped in enough legal and financial structure to look like policy, but built around one central precedent. When the United States orders an allied nation to comply, that nation complies. The ultimatum was sent through official diplomatic channels, but its contents were quickly leaked to 3 major American financial outlets in a move trade analysts widely read as intentional. The leak itself was part of the pressure campaign. By exposing the terms publicly, the White House guaranteed that Canada's answer would also have to be public. There would be no quiet compromise, no hidden adjustment, no face-saving middle ground. Canada would either visibly submit or visibly refuse, and the White House believed the economic reality made public refusal impossible. There were four major demands. First, Canada would have to remove every retaliatory tariff it had imposed during the previous 18 months of the dispute. All of them, unilaterally, with no matching rollback from Washington. The message was unmistakable. 4. Canada's tariffs were being treated as illegitimate reactions to legitimate American policy. Repealing them was not presented as a concession, it was presented as an admission of error. Canada was expected not only to stop resisting, but to reverse its resistance. Second, Canada would have to accept American regulatory control over its critical minerals export system. Not cooperation, not consultation, oversight. The proposed framework would give American officials practical veto power over where Canadian lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth minerals could be sold. The official justification was national security. 4. The practical effect was to block Canada from expanding its critical mineral exports to non-American buyers, to bind its most strategic resources to American supply chains. 4. And to make Carney's months-long diversification plan nearly impossible to carry out. Third, Canada would agree to minimum purchase levels for American manufactured products, specific dollar values, specific sectors, 4 specific categories, a managed trade arrangement that placed Canadian procurement under American export priorities. This was not free trade, it was not fair trade, it was directed trade. 4. Canada would buy what Washington wanted it to buy, in the amounts Washington demanded, on the schedule Washington selected. 4th, disputes under the agreement would be handled through a process where the United States held unilateral interpretive power. In plain terms, if Canada and the United States disagreed about whether Canada was complying, the United States would decide the answer. The accuser and the judge would be the same party. The deadline was 30 days, not 90, not 6 months, not the kind of timeline that allows governments to negotiate, revise, consult, form, and preserve dignity. 30 days, barely enough time to fully model the economic consequences, let alone build a serious alternative. The timeline was part of the weapon. It narrowed Canada's room to think. Comply immediately or face punishment. Do not study, do not calculate, do not deliberate. Decide. The threat behind the ultimatum was sweeping. Full tariffs across the entire range of Canadian goods. 4. Restrictions affecting Canadian banks' access to American capital markets, and the possible use of emergency economic powers, allowing the president to freeze selected categories of cross-border transactions by executive order. In the first week after the demand was issued, 3 allied governments contacted Ottawa privately. Each delivered the same warning in different language. Accept. The cost of saying no is too high. The Americans are serious. 4. Take the deal now, then try to adjust the terms later from inside a position of compliance rather than outside it in open defiance. Canada's own economic modeling appeared to point in the same direction. Finance Ministry examined 14 scenarios. In 11 of them, rejecting the ultimatum pushed Canada into recession within 2 quarters. In 9, the Canadian dollar fell between 8 and 14% against the US dollar. In every scenario, Canada's short-term losses were at least 3 times larger than the short-term losses faced by the United States. The numbers were plain, the projections were plain, the advice from allies was plain. Every model, every simulation, every historical comparison pointed to the same answer. The rational choice, according to standard diplomatic and economic thinking, was to comply. Take the humiliation, accept the terms, absorb the immediate political damage. Negotiate later, when conditions changed. Hope the president would not carry the threat as far as it appeared. Hope that submission today might create leverage tomorrow. One senior economic advisor later told the Financial Times that Carney's team spent 11 days reviewing every model, every precedent, every possible scenario. In every traditional analysis, compliance was the safer course. The numbers were clear. The risks of refusal were concrete, measurable, and serious. But Carney asked the question the models did not answer. What happens after compliance? Not the first week, not the first quarter. The structural aftermath. What happens to Canada's bargaining position 5 years later if it proves that American ultimatums succeed? What happens to Canadian control over its own resources if it accepts foreign oversight even once? 4a. What happens to the global trading system if the second largest bilateral trade relationship in the world becomes a structure where one side commands and the other side obeys? The models could estimate the cost of refusal. 4a. They could not estimate the cost of precedent, and Carney decided the precedent would cost more. Then the deadline arrived, and he did what every conventional model said Canada could not afford to do. Faye. The rejection came from the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. It was not a press conference. It was not a written statement released quietly through diplomatic channels. It was a scheduled national address, carried live by every major Canadian network and simulcast internationally. Carney stood behind the podium with the Canadian flag behind him. He held no papers. No teleprompter was visible. 4a. The room was packed with domestic journalists, foreign correspondents, and 3 camera crews that had been alerted that the speech would be important. The feeling in the room was not the feeling of an ordinary government announcement. 4a. There was a pressure in the air, the sense that people understood they were about to hear something that could not be undone. He spoke for 12 minutes. For the first 11, he gave a precise, data-heavy account of Canada's progress toward economic diversification, new trade agreements, new infrastructure investments, new supply chain partnerships. He presented each element with the calm discipline that had marked his years as a central banker. Charts, percentages, timelines, named countries, signed agreements, dollar values. He delivered it without anger. Without theatrical defiance, without making it sound like a response to a threat. He spoke the way a chief financial officer would present a completed restructuring plan to a board. Decisions already made, execution already underway. The lack of emotion was the point. This was not improvisation. This had been in motion for months. The ultimatum did not create the plan. It merely brought the announcement forward. Then, in the final minute, he turned directly to the American demand. He paused. He looked into the camera, and he spoke with the measured rhythm of someone issuing a legal finding, not a campaign statement. He said Canada had examined the American proposal in full. He said Canada had consulted allies, economists, legal experts, and trading partners. Then he delivered the words that changed the direction of the standoff, and possibly the direction of the global trading order. Canada does not accept ultimatums. Canada's economic diversification is not a bargaining chip. It is not temporary. It is not leverage. It is a permanent and irrevocable restructuring of Canada's economic relationships, and it is already in motion. Permanent and irrevocable, those were the words. The one that trade lawyers immediately seized on was irrevocable. Irrevocable is not ordinary political language. It belongs to law. It appears in contracts, treaties, and binding international instruments. It does not mean something will not be reversed. It means it cannot be reversed. Carney chose that word with the precision of a man who had spent his career in 2 of the world's most powerful central banks, where the placement of a single word can move markets. By saying irrevocable, he was not simply promising that his government would not retreat. He was signaling that the changes had been built to outlast politics. The trade agreements, the infrastructure commitments, and the supply chain shifts had been structured through contracts, timelines, and institutions strong enough to survive future governments, changing political moods, and even a thaw in relations with Washington. Diversification was not a threat. It was a fact. It was already happening, and it had been designed not to be reversed. The rejection reached Washington at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. In the first 15 minutes, the White House press office received 46 inquiries from reporters. No official statement followed. No background briefing was offered. At 4:30 p.m., the press secretary's office issued one line saying the administration was reviewing the Prime Minister's remarks. They are still reviewing them. What Trump expected after the deadline was clear. He expected financial markets to punish Canada. He expected the Canadian dollar to fall. He expected Canadian business leaders to pressure Carney publicly to retreat. He expected other governments to stay neutral. Because neutrality is the default when a smaller economy confronts a larger one. He expected Canada to endure a few painful weeks, then returned to negotiations, prepared to accept a softened version of the same basic structure. 4a. That is not what happened. In the first 24 hours, the Canadian dollar did not collapse. It held. Not because the central bank intervened, not because of emergency monetary action. 4. It held because markets made a calculation the White House had not expected. They looked at a country with a long-term strategy, a country reducing dependence on an unpredictable trading partner. 4. A country whose leadership appeared guided by structural analysis rather than fear, and they judged that country to be safer than one issuing threats it could not afford to carry out. Within hours, 4. Two major international credit rating agencies affirmed Canada's sovereign rating with stable outlooks. The wording in both statements mattered. One cited policy clarity and strategic consistency. 4. The other pointed to credible long-term diversification that reduced dependence on a single market. Both phrases meant the same thing. The agencies saw Carney's refusal not as instability, but as evidence of stability. Canada was becoming safer from a credit perspective because it was reducing exposure to an unpredictable partner. Then the international response began, and it moved in the opposite direction from what Washington had predicted. 4. The European Union moved first. Its chief trade officials released a formal statement supporting the right of every sovereign nation to determine its own trade relationships without coercive outside pressure. The wording was cautious. 4. It did not mention the United States. It did not have to. Japan followed. 6 hours after the EU statement, Japan's trade ministry announced that 2 bilateral agreements with Canada, both under negotiation for more than a year, 4a would be accelerated. South Korea came next, then Australia, then the United Kingdom, whose statement was noticeably warmer toward Canada than anything London had said publicly during the dispute. Third, Britain referred to rules-based trade among sovereign partners, a phrase analysts immediately understood as a contrast to the proposed system of unilateral American authority. Within 48 hours, 7 countries had publicly aligned themselves with Canada's position, not through a formal alliance, not through coordinated action, through something stronger in this context, independent alignment. Each nation, acting for its own reasons, reached the same conclusion. But the real turning point came in the next 24 hours. 4 countries that had been privately negotiating compliance with separate American trade demands paused those talks. That was the cascade Washington had failed to model. Washington had treated Canada as an isolated case. It had modeled the bilateral trade relationship, tariff effects, currency effects, and GDP projections. 4a. What it had not modeled was the demonstration effect, the second-order consequence of one public refusal succeeding, because this ultimatum was never only about Canada, it was about precedent. 4. Every country facing American trade pressure was watching. They wanted to know what would happen when a mid-sized economy refused. More, they wanted to know whether the cost of defiance was truly as high as Washington needed everyone to believe. Canada refused. The cost was lower than expected. The international support was broader than expected. 4. The market punishment did not arrive, and 4 governments in 4 different regions came to the same conclusion on their own. If Canada can refuse and survive, then the equation has changed. 4. The price of defiance had been recalculated. Not slightly, fundamentally. The premium other nations had been paying to avoid confrontation, the concessions they had been making, the sovereignty they had been surrendering quietly, 4 might no longer be necessary. The ultimatum did not just affect Canada. It helped everyone watching, and everyone was watching. 4. Paused negotiations represented more than $200 billion in combined trade volume with the United States. Not terminated, not lost, paused, and in diplomacy, paused can be more damaging than canceled. Canceled means an arrangement has ended. Paused means the arrangement is under review. It means terms once considered acceptable are no longer automatically accepted. It means leverage once assumed is now being questioned. 4. This is where the story stops being about Canada and the United States alone. It becomes something structural, something beyond these 2 leaders, beyond this confrontation, beyond even the 80-year framework that is just cracked. The change is permanent, not because anyone declared it permanent, but because permanence was built into the rejection from the start. Three forces make it irreversible. The first is the credibility ratchet. 4. Ultimatums are depreciating assets. Every successful ultimatum makes the next one more believable. Every failed ultimatum makes the next one less believable. 4. Trump's demand to Canada was meant to prove that American economic leverage was absolute. Its failure proved the opposite. The next time Washington issues a trade ultimatum to any country, Canada will be part of the calculation. 4. They refused. They survived. The coalition held. Markets did not punish them. Why should we comply? That question is now permanently lodged inside every trade negotiation the United States enters. 4a. The second force is the coalition effect. Before Canada's refusal, countries under American trade pressure were isolated. They negotiated alone, they calculated alone, they complied alone. Isolation was part of the leverage. 4. One country standing against the United States faces enormous risk. The asymmetry is too large. The political danger is too serious. The chance of retaliation is too high. A rational actor does not usually take that risk alone. 4. But when several nations stand together, the math changes. Risk is shared. Retaliation is diluted. Political cover is mutual. Canada's rejection created something that had not existed before. A visible, public, documented group of nations willing to defend economic defiance of the United States, not as hostility, but as sovereignty. Once coalitions form, they do not vanish simply because the original event ends. 4. They endure because every participant lowers the risk for every other participant. The more countries stand together, the less any one country risks by standing at all. The coalition begins reinforcing itself. 4. It expands not by persuasion, but by self-interest, and it cannot be broken by pressuring one member, because the existence of the coalition is what shields each member from pressure. The third force is infrastructure lock-in. This is what makes the shift truly irreversible. Whatever happens politically, whatever elections come next, whoever sits in the White House next year or a decade from now, Canada's trade agreements are not speeches. They are contracts. They contain timelines, investment obligations, penalties for withdrawal, and governance systems that operate beyond the preferences of one administration, the shipping routes being built, the Arctic corridors, the Pacific port expansions, the redirected LNG terminals. These are not talking points. They are physical assets: concrete, steel, fiber optic cable. 4. You do not dismantle a pipeline because the president who triggered its construction leaves office. You do not tear up a trade agreement because the confrontation that inspired it cools down. You do not reroute a supply chain that required 2 years and billions of dollars because someone makes a phone call. The fast graph outlives politics. It always has. Far more. The trade networks created during the decline of the British Empire did not reverse when British policy changed. The manufacturing chains that shifted to Asia in the 1990s did not simply return when American trade policy shifted. Physical and contractual infrastructure creates switching costs so high that the new arrangement becomes the default permanent arrangement. Canada's diversification was built that way from the beginning. Not as a temporary pressure tactic, as an infrastructure project. And once infrastructure is built, it shapes the landscape for decades. The shift is not coming. The shift has already occurred. The rejection was the announcement. The restructuring was already in motion. Then Warren Buffett spoke. What he offered was not partisan commentary. It was not diplomatic analysis. It was a structural judgment from a man who has spent 60 years studying how markets behave, how leverage functions, and what happens when leverage fails. Buffett said the most important thing about leverage is that it rests on one thing: credibility. A bank has leverage over a borrower only if the borrower believes the bank will call the loan. An employer has leverage over an employee only if the employee believes the employer will follow through. A country has leverage over a trading partner only if the trading partner believes defiance is too costly to survive. Then he paused. The moment the borrower realizes the bank cannot afford to call the loan, the leverage flips. The moment the employee realizes the employer cannot afford to fire them, power shifts. And the moment a trading partner proves in public that defiance is survivable, the ultimatum stops being a tool of power, not weakened, finished because leverage is binary. Either the threat is credible or it is not. Once it is not, repeating it louder does not make it credible again. Buffett applied that directly to the confrontation. What Carney showed, he said, is that the United States cannot afford to fully enforce the ultimatum it issued. 4. The threatened enforcement, full tariffs across Canadian goods, financial sector restrictions, emergency economic powers would inflict more damage on the American economy than Canadian compliance would ever return. Full American agriculture would risk losing access to its largest export market. American automakers, whose supply chains crossed the border repeatedly, would face shutdowns affecting plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. 4. American energy systems relying on Canadian natural gas, hydroelectric power, and uranium would face disruptions that would take years and billions of dollars to replace. American consumers would see higher prices on lumber, pharmaceuticals, fresh produce, and countless other goods, right in the middle of an election cycle. Then Buffett let the point land. Enforcement was always more expensive than compliance was valuable. Washington knew that. 4. But it did not matter, because the ultimatum was never meant to be enforced. It was meant to be believed. The threat was the instrument, not the punishment. And a threat only works if no one tests it. Carney tested it. And by testing it, he revealed what stood behind it. Not American strength, American overextension. A threat so costly to execute that it could only operate as a bluff. And once a bluff is called publicly, in front of 193 countries and every financial market on earth, the bluffer does not get to bluff the same way again. Buffett then drew the comparison that quieted the room. He said he had watched the same dynamic unfold in 1992. The Bank of England had committed to defending the pound's position inside the European exchange rate mechanism. That commitment was public, absolute, foreign, and backed by the institutional weight of one of the oldest central banks in the world. And it worked until someone tested it. George Soros tested it. 4. He calculated that the cost of defending the peg was greater than the Bank of England's willingness to pay. He bet against the pound with billions of dollars, placing one massive position against one of the world's most respected financial institutions. The Bank of England spent billions. It raised interest rates to punishing levels. 4. It burned through foreign currency reserves at a pace that could not continue. It used every instrument available. For a brief moment, it appeared that institutional credibility might hold the line. Then it broke on September 16, 1992, Black Wednesday. Britain withdrew from the ERM, the pound fell. Soros made more than $1 billion in a single day. 4. And the mechanism that had been described as unbreakable was exposed as a promise that could not survive a direct test by someone willing to bear the risk. The pound did not regain its ERM position. It never went back. 4. Not because Britain was incapable of trying. Not because economics had changed forever overnight, because credibility had disappeared. Markets had seen the mechanism fail, and once a mechanism has failed, it can no longer claim to be unbreakable. The claim itself begins to sound like denial. Buffett tied that lesson directly to the present moment. What Carney broke, he said, was the same kind of mechanism. The belief that American trade ultimatums enforce themselves. The belief that the threat alone is enough. The belief that no country will test the threat because the consequences are too severe. Canada tested it. 4. The consequences did not arrive, and that belief, once broken, does not put itself back together. It is gone permanently. Buffett's final point was quiet, restrained, and devastating because it was simple. Every dominant market position eventually reaches a moment where dominance stops being structural and becomes reputational. The market share is still visible. The revenue still flows. The brand still carries power. 4. But the structural advantage that created that dominance has already weakened. What remains is the assumption that the dominance still exists. The greatest danger to any dominant player is not the arrival of a challenger. 4. It is a challenger succeeding, because success changes the one thing power cannot easily restore. It changes the assumption. 4. He looked into the camera and said every country that trades with the United States has now watched Canada reject an ultimatum and survive. That, he said, is not a diplomatic event. It is a market event. And markets remember. 4. Inside the United States, the political fallout moved in directions the White House had not anticipated. The issue was not simply partisan, it was structural. The failure of the ultimatum raised a question bigger than party or ideology. If American trade leverage relies on credible threats, and those threats have now been publicly discredited, what replaces them? Within 72 hours, 4 Republican senators released statements. None named the president directly, but all made the same point in different words. American economic leadership cannot be based on coercion. It has to be based on competitiveness. 4A. If trade partners are choosing to reduce dependence on American markets, the solution is not to threaten them for leaving. The solution is to create markets worth staying in. 3. Former trade representatives published a joint analysis arguing that the ultimatum model had been weakening for years. Canada's rejection, they wrote, was not the cause of the shift. It was the proof. The expectation of automatic compliance had been eroding through every trade confrontation of the last decade. The Canada ultimatum was simply the moment the erosion became visible. The crack had reached the surface. 4A. One of those former trade representatives later put it plainly in a television interview. The United States had been acting as though market size alone was sufficient leverage. 4. That only worked as long as trading partners believed they had no alternatives. Canada just showed them the alternatives. And those alternatives are not theories. They have contracts. They have schedules. 4A. They have infrastructure budgets. You cannot defeat concrete with threats. Business leaders in the United States understood the implications immediately. 4. Executives running companies with global supply chains began reassessing their exposure, not only to Canada, but to the broader assumption of American trade dominance. 4A. The Business Roundtable released a statement calling for a fundamental reassessment of America's competitive position in global markets, based on value creation rather than the application of pressure. 4. But the international consequences were the most important and the least reversible. 4. European trade officials told Reuters that Carney's refusal had accelerated internal conversations about supply chain diversification that had previously been too politically sensitive to discuss openly. 4. No European government wanted to be the first to openly design its economy around reduced dependence on the United States. That would have looked like hostility toward an ally. 4A. It would have sounded like an admission that the transatlantic relationship could no longer be fully trusted. Many were thinking it. No one wanted to say it first. Canada went first. By going first, Canada absorbed the political cost every other country had avoided. After that, the path looked different. Not hostile, prudent, sovereign. Carney's framing mattered. By defining diversification as economic sovereignty rather than anti-American action, he gave other countries the vocabulary they needed to pursue the same strategy without making it look like an attack. 4. Japan's trade minister spoke of economic relationships based on mutual respect rather than asymmetric dependency. Australia's Treasury Secretary used the phrase structural resilience in a way trade analysts immediately recognized as code for reduced American exposure. Different words, same destination. 4A. And that is the paradox the White House discovered in the 72 hours after the rejection. The paradox that made the moment not merely damaging, but almost impossible to answer. If Trump enforces the threatened penalties, the United States damages itself at least as much as it damages Canada, especially now that allied nations are supporting Canada's diversification. Every dollar of damage inflicted through enforcement is matched or exceeded by damage to American industries, supply chains, and consumers. Enforcement would not punish Canada alone. It would punish both economies while showing the world that Washington would rather accept mutual harm than tolerate a smaller country saying no. If Trump escalates beyond trade into diplomacy or security, he creates the most serious allied crisis since NATO was founded. Moving against a NATO ally would force European governments that have tried to remain careful and restrained to respond. The institutional cost could take a generation to repair. If Trump negotiates, negotiation itself becomes an admission. The ultimatum said the terms were final and the consequences were real. Returning to negotiate different terms proves the consequences were not enforceable. From then on, Every future trade demand carries an asterisk. Remember Canada, they said no. And the punishment never came, and if Trump does nothing, 4, the rejection remains. The coalition hardens. Diversification accelerates. Infrastructure gets built. The precedent becomes permanent memory inside foreign ministries, trade offices, and economic planning departments across the world. 4, silence is only the slowest road to the same place. The permanent devaluation of American trade ultimatums as an instrument of foreign economic policy. Every route leads to the same destination. The mechanism is broken, fully. The only question is how fast the consequence become fully visible. So this is where the matter stands. Donald Trump issued the most aggressive trade ultimatum an American president has ever delivered to an allied nation. 30-day deadline, 4 demands. Each designed to prove that American economic leverage was absolute and that compliance was mandatory. Mark Carney rejected every demand in public, without ambiguity, using one decisive word, 4, irrevocable, to show that Canada's answer was not a negotiating position, but a structural commitment that future governments would not be able to unwind. Within 72 hours, 7 nations publicly supported Canada's position. 4 nations paused their own compliance negotiations with Washington. 2 credit rating agencies reaffirmed Canada's sovereign rating. The Canadian dollar held firm. 4. International investment banks recommended increased exposure to Canada, and the coalition that did not exist before the rejection now exists in lasting form. FAE, the mechanism the United States has relied on for 80 years to win trade confrontations, the assumption that defiance costs more than compliance, was tested. It failed. The failure was public, measurable, full, and documented clearly enough that every country on Earth can now study and repeat the strategy. Not because those countries are hostile to America, but because they watched Canada do the math and saw that the math worked. For Warren Buffett called it the most significant act of economic defiance since Soros broke the Bank of England. He explained, with the clarity of someone who has spent 6 decades studying leverage, 4, that the ultimatum was never designed to be enforced. It was designed to be believed, and once belief breaks, it does not return. Trump issued the ultimatum because he believed the size of the American economy made refusal impossible. 4. He believed no country 1/10 America's size would accept the risk. He believed the numbers were so overwhelming that compliance was the only rational choice. Instead, the ultimatum exposed what the numbers had concealed. American trade leverage had been eroding quietly for years. It was sustained not by permanent structural advantage, but by the belief that such advantage still existed. No one had tested that belief because no one had been willing to pay the price of testing it. Carney paid the price. The belief broke. What appeared underneath was not simple American weakness. It was something more dangerous to American interests than weakness. Overestimation. The belief that a tool still works long after the conditions that made it effective have disappeared. 4. The belief that a bluff never has to be defended because nobody will dare call it. The belief that dominance is permanent because dominance has existed for so long. 4. It may have been the most expensive assumption in the history of American economic foreign policy, and now it has collapsed. Trump tried to use an ultimatum to force Canada into submission. Instead, the ultimatum forced a question the entire international system is now answering. What happens when the world's largest economy makes a final demand and a country 1/10 its size says no? 4. What happens when the bluff is called and the bluffer must choose between enforcement and retreat? What happens when every other nation watching realizes that the emperor's leverage has no close? The answer arrived in 72 hours. 4. And that answer changed everything. Not because Canada is overwhelmingly powerful, but because Canada proved defiance can be survived, and once defiance is survivable, compliance becomes a choice. 4. And once compliance becomes a choice, the leverage that depended on compliance being mandatory disappears, not reduced, not softened. Gone 80 years of American trade dominance rested on one assumption. One assumption tested by one country that calculated the risk, accepted the cost, and proved the calculation had changed. The ultimatum was the test. The rejection was the answer. And the answer, delivered from a podium in Ottawa by a man who understood exactly what he was doing, was irrevocable.